Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Darna Noor, joining you from Baltimore. U.S. President Donald Trump signed executive orders to advance the construction of both highly controversial pipelines, the Keystone XL and the Dakota Access Pipeline, at the White House in Washington, January 4th, 2017. There's already been a massive amount of protest for the president's actions. Our next guest says that key Trump donor and trusted advisor, oil billionaire Harold Hamm, stands to profit from the president's order to approve Keystone XL, Dakota Access Pipelines. That guest is, of course, Steve Horn. Steve is a research fellow for DeSmogBlog and a freelance investigative journalist whose work is featured in The Intercept, The Guardian, The Nation, and Truth Out. Thanks for joining me again, Steve. Welcome back.
Good to be on. Thanks for having me.
So talk about Trump's relationship to Harold Hamm and Hamm's connection to both the Keystone XL and the Dakota Access Pipelines.
So really the first time where Hamm became a political story, not just an industry story, but kind of where the oil industry intersects with politics, and in this case presidential politics, was in 2012, where Reuters broke a pretty big investigative story that showed that Hamm had created both a super PAC and a lobbying organization called the Domestic Energy Producers Alliance, which at that time, in the years leading up to the 2012 election between Romney and Obama, had created this advocacy effort to push through something, a Bakken shale on-ramp, so a ramp onto the Keystone XL that would load 100,000 barrels a day of oil obtained from fracking in the Bakken shale, which is the same basin through which the Dakota Access Pipeline runs. And because Keystone XL never ended up going through for the northern leg of it, the one that would have crossed through that area where the on-ramp was going to be situated, Hamm, a couple of years later, pretty famously came out and said, hey, look, Keystone is now, quote-unquote, irrelevant. It just so happens that about that same time, the Dakota Access Pipeline was proposed in the various states that it runs through, and got the permits it needed in all those states. To this date, the only permit it doesn't have is the one that it needs through the Army Corps of Engineers. And if you look at recent filings and corporate presentations that Continental Resources, the company that Harold Hamm founded and is now still the CEO of, the biggest fracker in the Bakken Shale, its presentation says that it plans to load its oil onto the Dakota Access. And so Keystone may have become, quote unquote, irrelevant for them. That's because what became very relevant for them was the Dakota Access Pipeline, which still needs that outstanding permit from the Army Corps of Engineers. So if you look at these two presidential memos or executive orders issued by Trump, it's unclear if what the deal is with Hamm's current ties to TransCanada. I think that TransCanada would put out new calls for basically contracts to load for companies to put their oil through that pipeline. But it's definitely clear that he used to have a direct tie to the Keystone XL, and it's extremely clear that he has a contractual tie to the Dakota Access Pipeline as both the biggest pumper of oil through fracking in North Dakota, and also as one of the contractors that will pump its oil through that pipeline.
Howard Hamm was interviewed the other day on CNBC. It was actually the day before Trump's inauguration. Let's take a look at a clip from that interview.
There are just dozens, hundreds, if you will, of over-regulation examples, in all those areas: oil, gas, clean coal, power. The government has been end up picking winners and losers, as you know, for the past 8 years, and certainly need to get out of that business. So,
when asked about energy regulations, Hamm also said consumers are also paying for that, so it's very costly to the American economy. Steve, talk about that assertion that consumers pay for regulation. For instance, the GOP has thrown around numbers for years that the Dakota pipeline, or that the Keystone pipeline, would create as many as tens of thousands of jobs. President Trump is echoing that. Is he right? How many permanent jobs would the Keystone XL pipeline actually create, and how many temporary jobs?
So to answer the regulations question, I'll get to that second. But the jobs question, Trump said 28,000 jobs. the State Department said in its environmental impact statement that it put out under Obama through the State Department that it would create somewhere between 2,500 to 4,500 ballpark range of temporary jobs, and then went ahead and said once those are to build the pipeline, construct it, all the work that goes into that. But once it's actually in the ground, it will actually only create 35 full-time jobs. So that's not to scoff at those jobs, whether it's 35, whether it's several thousand, those are still jobs, but it's far less jobs than the 28,000 that Trump cited when he signed that particular executive order for the Keystone XL. And then the other question about regulations and Hamm's statements about those, of course, what he doesn't mention is that people who live in the communities that would be deregulated pay the consequences in terms of health impacts of breathing in that dirty air. For example, Cancer Alley is a good example. I'll just use that one. If you look at where the Dakota Access Pipeline terminates, that's down in the Gulf Coast, in a refinery row where there's lots of oil and gas refineries. And that particular row of refineries is known as Cancer Alley because so many people develop cancer from the air impacts of those refineries. So there are, of course, jobs that would be created by actually regulating that sort of thing, if you look at it from that perspective. But then there's just the big question of how much profit do these companies need compared to the health impacts. Then the bigger question is, of course, regulating carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that are emitted from these particular facilities. Those, I would say, supersede any sort of worries that these particular companies have about a little bit of profit that they would end up losing from having to abide by regulations.
And I want to finish just by asking you about the resistance we're seeing to Trump's executive orders to advance both of these pipelines. The Real News has been covering some of the actions that have been going on in D.C. Talk about the momentum that resistance is getting.
So I think that we're going to see more of what we already saw with Keystone XL. We saw one of the big, that was the first one, one of the biggest grassroots mobilizations nationwide of a pipeline in U.S. history. We saw that even bigger in a way for Dakota Access because that was a prolonged occupation of the site around the Dakota Access Pipeline. I expect, I don't know if those same exact actions will repeat themselves, but I expect actions like them to be most likely escalated, given that lots of the groups that were involved in those protests at the time had some somewhat close ties to the Democratic Party, to President Obama, and were pretty cautious about how they worded their opposition. I don't expect that same caution to exist with Donald Trump in office, so I expect it to be maybe a bit more, even more direct action oriented, civil disobedience oriented. Those are just my guesses, but we're already seeing mobilizations popping up even without any major call for action. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see many calls to action in the coming days and weeks by major environmental groups and other grassroots groups around the country.
And we'll be sure to keep you posted on those actions here on the Real News Network. So, Steve, thanks so much for joining us again today.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.